Hi everyone, Patricia Worby Alchemy Therapies here, and this is another in my ongoing series about coronavirus diaries. Well, we're now 2 months on from the initial lockdown in the UK, and we're just now coming out with some release of restrictions. So it seems an apt time to review where we are and why we've got to where we are. And for a large part of this video, I'm going to be relying on some massively important information that I have garnered from watching a very prestigious doctor called Dr. Zach Bush, who he specializes in virology, the microbiome, but he's also interested in maternity. He's worked on maternity wards, and actually he's an environmentalist, and he seems to have a lot of knowledge, a very broad range of knowledge. I will post a link to his video below, but it's 1 hour and 22 minutes, well worth your time. But I thought I would summarize a little of what I learned from that based on some of my understanding as well, because in 2017 I wrote a book called The World Within, which was looking at the importance of the microbiome as a feature of being human. In other words, we are not single people, isolated as we've been told. We are actually a community of organisms that live on our skin, up our nose, in our mouth, down in our gut. In fact, every surface, and in fact in the air that we breathe, there are trillions of microbes, bacteria, fungi, parasites, all sorts of organisms. There are even specific viruses that live on bacteria. They're called bacteriophages. And there are trillions of them, and they're everywhere. And we're in constant communication with them, and we're in constant communication with their genetics. The so-called genome, which is the sum total of all the DNA of the microbes that live on and in us. And sometimes they're separated into the virome, which relates to viruses, genome. But that's a very important part of the microbiome, because viruses have a very specific function. They are designed to kind of push evolution, to push change and biological genomic change, so variation, which we know is the basis of evolution. And so here we are now understanding that the microbiome is the key to life itself. It's actually the key to what makes this planet sustainable, being not just part of us, but part of the animal life, plant life, soil life. It's in the air, in the oceans, and it's constantly mutating and exchanging information. Now, obviously, if we look at viruses in that way, seeing them as part of a bigger picture, then we have to ask ourselves, why have we put so much attention onto this one virus by naming it, screening for it, publicizing it in every way, and making it something that we're terribly fearful of? Now, obviously, people are dying and have been dying with COVID-19. But I would question whether, if we'd done the same with the flu epidemic in 2018, which was a very bad year, actually, and a lot more people died than have currently died from COVID-19, but it was just never publicized, so we didn't have the awareness and the fear mongering that we're seeing right now. So these viruses do tend to rise up. They tend to sweep through a population in various ways. We're told, obviously, that it's by touch, by breathing out droplets, getting it on our hands, from touching other people. That's not actually the only way that the virus is communicated between people. It's actually in the air as an aerosol as well. And no amount of masking is going to affect that, because you're going to get it in your eyes, just because airflow is everywhere. You cannot live in a bubble. Even if you stay indoors, which is what we've been doing, we're still getting airflow across the planet and in our homes, and actually airflow is a good thing generally. So we've got to question really whether the kind of lockdown we've had and the kind of sort of isolation that we've encouraged people to do is really what's causing the decrease in transmission. Or is it, as Dr. Bush very eloquently outlines, more to do with the fact that there are huge correlations with pollution and respiratory disease. And that what COVID-19 may be doing is unmasking the normal ability of the body to absorb the effects of pollution in our lungs and on respiratory mucosal surfaces in the nose, mouth, throat, and in the lungs itself. So anyway, this is a very important point to understand, that the epicenters have largely been in areas that either have an elderly population, so northern Italy definitely has that situation, or high pollution, as in China, and also, as in America, a very high degree of aerosol spraying of glyphosate and other pesticides and herbicides, which do change the microbiome. They do change the genetics of the soil, of the plants that they're sprayed onto deliberately, but that also has ramifications for us when we eat the plants. And that's something I talked about in the book, was the effect of glyphosate, which is particularly insidious. It mimics glycine, which is a natural amino acid in the body, and attaches itself in place of glycine and can cause all sorts of problems. Some scientists believe it might be linked to vascular disease, cerebrovascular disease, which happens in the brain and may be a precursor for dementia. And so there are these correlations. And what we have to understand, therefore, is that we are messing with something we don't really understand yet. We have isolated one virus, and we've started to notice that people with comorbidities, people that already have sickness in some way or another, are the ones that are most at risk. So the risk factors we've isolated: age, race, because we've noticed that dark-skinned people are much worse off, and that could be both to do with their biology. We know that their vitamin D levels are likely to be a lot lower, and vitamin D is a great immunoenhancer. It helps to switch off the overreaction, the cytokine storm, as it's called, which tends to cause secondary infection of ARDS, which I've talked about in previous videos. So vitamin D is very protective, and darker skinned people tend to make less of it in the same conditions of light. They make it much more slowly in the skin, and so definitely suffer from that deficiency. But there will also be health inequality, of course. Then the tendency to get higher rates of blood sugar imbalances and diabetes, and so be on diabetic medications. We have to look at the way we are treated medically in industrialized nations. So what does the UK and the US have in common? Because we're both top of the tree as far as deaths go in the world right now, although Brazil, I think, is coming up to meet us. Well, we have a very medicalized system. So people are given drugs to cope with things that could naturally and normally be dealt with by changing diet and lifestyle. And we're not doing that. We're just giving people drugs, and sometimes prophylactically. In other words, we're giving people drugs to prevent something that hasn't actually happened yet. So for instance, in the case of statins, a lot of people are put on statins when their cholesterol goes high, as it tends to do as you get older and you are not eating well. You are eating high carbohydrate foods instead of having a more balanced diet of high fat. So there is that. And actually what we've noticed is that all of the comorbidities, these other diseases that tend to make your risk higher, tend to be related to a particular receptor called the ACE2 receptor. And this is the one that the virus seems to attack or allow as an entry point into the body. And what is an ACE2 inhibitor? An ACE2 inhibitor is something that's given to people with high blood pressure, with diabetes, with kidney disease. And these are all high correlations that you're just not hearing. You're not hearing what people are on when they get secondary ARDS from COVID-19. You're just hearing that they were diabetics with other conditions, other health conditions. So it's been well shown that what statins, ACE inhibitors, blood pressure reducing medication, and another medicine which is called an ARB, is that all they have in common is they tend to block the ACE2 receptor, and thus the body, in order to re-regulate itself, has to overexpress that receptor on the surface of the lining of the either the lung or wherever it is in the kidney or the heart. And so what you're doing is actually creating more entry points for the virus to enter the body and overwhelm the immune system. And plus, you are weakening the body's natural defenses, because if your blood pressure is badly regulated, you're going to get more secondary problems with poor blood flow. So we're creating the perfect storm of conditions for COVID-19 to affect people much more greatly than it would, say, in a country where they have a less industrialized medicine, where perhaps more naturopathic methods are used of diet, nutrition, lifestyle, and supplementation, for instance, which we've stopped doing in the UK, and I think the same is true in the US. So there is this real undercurrent that we're not being told, that actually if you really wanted to stop this secondary infection, which is what kills people, it isn't the initial viral load, because actually when we check for fever is one of the main symptoms, we were told right from the off. If you have a fever, self-isolate. If you've got a nasty cough and a fever, definitely self-isolate. But fever tends to only come in the second week. In the first week, you may be totally asymptomatic, or you may be just building this problem. And what the virus actually seems to do, it's not a respiratory virus as such. It tends to actually decrease the amount of oxygen being carried by the blood. It's a hypoxic insult, if you like. It reduces the ability of hemoglobin, which is in red blood cells, to actually grab onto oxygen and transport it around the body. And when that starts to happen, obviously the lungs start to fill with fluid, because it affects the transport of oxygen to and from. The same can happen in any organ, in fact, and that's why we're getting organ failure. But we're still treating this like the flu virus, as if it is a respiratory problem. And that's why forced ventilation, which is the standard of care still, once you get the breathing difficulties that some people are getting in the second week, and that is killing people because it's the wrong treatment. And this has been spoken about from ICUs across the world. Enlightened doctors have been saying forced ventilation does not work. 88% of people, once they're on forced ventilation, die. That's not a great outcome. And much better is to actually increase the amount of oxygen in the blood. And you can do that by putting oxygen directly through the nasal passages, which we are seeing, thankfully, in some of the top hospitals in the UK. But it's very much too little too late. And we're not looking at the causative issues of protecting the people that are most at risk, such as diabetics, and taking them off of all the medications that are making them more susceptible. Well, you won't see that, of course, because that threatens the whole industry, which is actually benefiting hugely from this whole scenario, unfortunately. And we're being told that the only solution is the vaccine. Well, we've had SARS, we've had MERS, and they were actually more deadly. They just weren't as transmissible, so they didn't reach as far. And also, we didn't pay as much attention, and so there wasn't this climate of fear around it. And there was never a vaccine developed for those, and yet they've pretty much died out. And that is what Dr. Bush maintains will happen with COVID-19. And there are a lot of people in the UK who agree with him, experts who agree that this tail off that we're seeing now of reductions in new cases is not just a result of the lockdown, although actually there is a reason that's worked, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's actually the natural cycle of a virus, because it will transport across the world, regardless of flights. It's actually in the air, so it's going to cross the Pacific in a few days from America to Europe, and then go around the world and pretty much simultaneously infect a huge amount of the population, who then have the chance to mount an immune response. And most people do that very effectively, so that they don't even know they've had it. And we've seen that, in fact, with the AIDS virus, with a lot of the retroviruses that are present when we check for them in the DNA of the human. And yet we've never suffered the symptoms, we've never had the disease as such. So this viral swapping of DNA, I think there's a figure that we have something like 50% of our DNA was introduced by viruses. It's part of the natural ecosystem to basically evolve us and our planet together to make us more biodiverse and therefore sustainable. And an important point I think he brought across really well was that when an ecosystem gets unbalanced, say when we're growing crops as a monoculture and we take out everything but the crop we want to grow, basically there's no diversity in the soil or the vegetation, and weeds grow up in order to bring diversity back. And then we spray the weeds off, we kill them because we don't want weeds because they reduce our so-called yield, which actually if we looked at it we would see that the quality is not as good. We have more quantity but less quality within the crops that we're growing. So weeds have a function to bring back diversity in the external ecosystem. And it is true to say that viruses could be said to be doing the same within our microbiome, the inner ecosystem. They're there to kind of reintroduce balance. And we've noticed this, for instance, in conditions like Lyme disease. There's the Helicobacter pylori, that's a bacterium, but is often present in the stomachs of people who are already quite toxic. Now, we tend to think that is what causes the issues of reflux or ulcers, but actually what we need to understand is that the whole thing is out of balance, and the Helicobacter pylori has come in, and so has the Lyme, to come and mop up the toxins and deal with them and excrete them from the body. And it's the imbalance that's the issue and causing the disease, not the one virus itself. It's unbelievable to have isolated this one virus and said that it's causing this whole panoply of problems when we're not looking at the wider issues of why and how this has arisen in a polluted world. And the reason I think lockdown has ironically helped us all, and we're seeing this tail off, is because instantly the pollutant levels in our towns and cities have gone down massively. And it seems to be the particulates, particularly less than 2.5 micron particulates, that are causing a sleeping issue in people's lungs, you know, that they might not have overt disease yet. They're completely unaware of it. So, and that probably what's happening with the virus is it's going in there to mop up this issue of particulate matter. And we've noticed that, that in fact, areas of high density pollutants tend to have the highest rates of flu viruses, of these kinds of respiratory issues. And that naturally, if we lived in harmony with our ecosystem, there wouldn't be these densities or pockets of disease. There would only be a broad general spread, and maybe some people would be sick, but they'd be the weaker members of the population. Maybe they're older. Maybe, they've got other conditions that they're not aware of. So it is very strange that we're only looking at the virus and not at the causation of why this virus has arisen in the first place, and why it's not seen as part of a continuum of viruses and microbes that are continually swapping their genes with us, and that we can influence. First of all, we can influence by getting out of this climate of fear and being afraid to touch each other and being afraid to go out into the world and being afraid to breathe the air and having to mask ourselves, which only in very limited circumstances is that going to help you. It's actually more to prevent droplets from spraying if you cough. And for asthmatics, it's actually been said that you shouldn't be wearing a mask because, of course, you're rebreathing carbon dioxide, which is never great. So I would go away from that, but I would also look at, reducing pollution, particularly in the autumn. And one of the things that Dr. Bush talked about, which really resonated with me because I have some training in ecology, is that naturally the Earth has a cycle of carbon emission and carbon absorption. Now we're coming into June now, and in June the leaves on the trees are fully out and they're absorbing massive amounts of carbon dioxide and giving out oxygen, of course. And so we're sequestering, that's the chemical term, for all the methane and the carbon dioxide that we've been producing from our industry, from meat production, and just generally from the way we're living. And that's likely absorbed in the summer months, which corresponds, of course, with a healthier population. Now, as the autumn approaches and leaves on the trees begin to drop, the carbon sequestering goes down. And what you then have is a rise in carbon monoxide, methane, and to some extent, general pollutants, as we tend to be more indoors and maybe using more transport mechanisms rather than walking or cycling. Things that we need to think about how we approach our winter, and maybe have a rule that we try and walk more, we try and reduce our outputs of carbon dioxide, because this seems to be really, really linked to the degree of flu season that we get, you know, how dirty the air is without this sequestering ability of the earth and the soil to absorb it as it would do in the summer months. So that's a really important thing. Also, we need to look at the way we're medicalizing our health sector, you know, and stop ventilating people, stop isolating them, because isolation is one of the things that is well known to cause a stress response in the body and kill people much, much more than the virus would, unfortunately. Of course, there are certain people that we need to maybe protect a little more, but not with total isolation. It's a really bad idea. So I've talked about the virus as being like a weed, which I think is a really good way of looking at it. So it's not bad per se. It's there to do something, which is to reharmonize our body, which has already got stressed and out of whack. Okay, so we really don't understand what we're doing, but we're going to learn. We're going to have to learn, because this won't be the only virus that we have. And now that we've been primed, as it were, to look out for them, I'm sure there'll be further outbreaks of new viruses at some point in the future. But unless we learn that we've got to look after our bodies, we've got to look after our planet, we're not going to actually learn, and we're going to have a worse situation come along our way in the very near future. What we could do now to help us would be to reduce our outputs, to learn to live more in harmony with our planet, to consume less. You know, I know that people are saying we need to learn the lessons, we need to live differently, let's not go back to normal. But I'm not seeing that. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing a lot of people. They're desperate to get back to car driving and going on holiday by plane, and you know, consuming the kind of foods, the pizzas, the burgers. The meat industry has a huge part to play in methane production, by the way. And one point that Dr. Bush outlined was the pig industry, you know, pork and bacon and ham. In the US particularly, pigs are grown on these huge lots where their feces, they don't see the earth, the ground. They're in concrete pens where they don't have any way to move. Their feces are collected and kept in lagoons because it's toxic waste. They're fed so many antibiotics to keep them healthy because they're not living in the most healthy way, that actually it's regarded as toxic waste. So, you know, we've come a long way from producing food that actually is like real food. And we have to stop spraying and growing industrialized crops. This isn't the way to live. It's killing us and our planet. In the second video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we can actually do to prevent some of the side effects we're seeing, and maybe to get into more of the sort of the bigger picture thinking that we need. So thanks for listening. I hope this has inspired you. Do check out the original video because he covers a lot more than I've covered here. This was a distillation. And subscribe. Thanks. Bye for now.